Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the life of Æsc, the founding monarch of Kent's royal dynasty, a remarkable ruler who transformed a collection of Germanic settlements into one of England's most prosperous early kingdoms. During the late 5th and early 6th centuries, we'll softly explore his rise from warrior prince to established king, from his youth fighting alongside his legendary father Hengist, to his peaceful establishment of trade networks that would make Kent the wealthiest corner of early medieval Britain, and finally to his legacy as founder of the Oiscingas dynasty that would rule for centuries, all while the myths of early Anglo-Saxon England slowly settled around this southeastern kingdom. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video if these gentle historical whispers bring you comfort. I'd love to hear in the comments below which aspects of early medieval history fascinate you most. Don't be shy. Our Sleepy Crown family is wonderfully welcoming, and your thoughts always bring such joy to our community. And if you'd like more of these soothing historical tales to accompany your journey to sleep, please subscribe to keep these tranquil stories coming your way. So cozy up under your softest blanket, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from 5th century Kent lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Æsc, later known as the first true king of Kent and founder of the Oiscingas dynasty, was born into a world of profound transformation, where the ancient certainties of Roman Britain were crumbling like autumn leaves, and new Germanic kingdoms were slowly taking root in the fertile soil of southeastern England. To understand Æsc's remarkable journey from warrior prince to founding monarch, we must first drift back to the twilight years of Roman Britain, when the great empire that had ruled these islands for nearly 4 centuries was gradually withdrawing its legions to defend more pressing frontiers along the Rhine and Danube. The year was approximately 410 CE, when Emperor Honorius sent his fateful letter to the British civitates, essentially telling them they must now look to their own defense, a moment that would echo through the centuries and set the stage for everything that would follow. Kent in these final Roman years was known as Cantiaca, home to the Canti tribe, a Celtic people who had long grown accustomed to Roman ways. Their territory stretched across what we now know as the modern county of Kent, bounded by the Thames estuary to the north, the English Channel to the south, and the mysterious forests of the Weald to the west. This was rich agricultural land, blessed with fertile river valleys and natural harbours that had made it attractive to traders and settlers for countless generations. The great Roman city of Duravernum, modern Canterbury, served as the administrative heart of this region, its straight roads radiating outward like spokes of a wheel to connect with ports at Dover, Richborough and Lympne. These coastal fortresses formed part of the Saxon shore, a defensive network established in the late 3rd century to guard against the very Germanic raiders who would eventually become Kent's new rulers. The irony was not lost on later chroniclers that these fortifications built to keep the Saxons out would eventually become strongholds for Saxon kings. But by the early 5th century, the Roman grip on Britain was loosening like fingers growing numb with cold. The great villa estates that had dotted the Kentish countryside were beginning to show signs of abandonment, their elaborate mosaic floors slowly disappearing under layers of earth and debris. Urban life, too, was contracting, as the complex systems of trade and administration that had sustained Roman civilization began to unravel. Canterbury's population dwindled, its grand public buildings fell into disrepair, and the once busy port at Dover saw fewer and fewer ships arriving from the continent. Into this vacuum of authority stepped a patchwork of local strongmen and petty kings, British chieftains who tried to maintain some semblance of order in their small territories. These men faced challenges on multiple fronts: Pictish raiders from the north, Irish pirates from the west, and increasingly bold Saxon sea wolves from across the North Sea. It was a time of uncertainty and fear, when smoke on the horizon might signal approaching enemies, and when the old Roman certainties had given way to a darker, more dangerous world. Yet this period of upheaval also created opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Germanic warrior bands, already familiar with British shores through generations of raiding, began to see possibilities beyond mere plunder. These seas they had crossed as enemies might also be navigated as settlers. These lands they had ravaged might also become new homes for their families and followers. The archaeological evidence from this transitional period paints a fascinating picture of cultural change. In some areas, Romano-British life continued much as before, with local elites maintaining their villa estates and the old ways of doing things. But in others, particularly along the eastern coast, most exposed to Germanic influence, new styles of pottery, jewelry, and burial customs began to appear, subtle signals of a population in flux. The Germanic peoples who would eventually transform Britain were not a unified nation, but rather a confederation of tribes and warrior bands, each with their own customs, dialects, and territorial ambitions. From the marshy lands of northwestern Germany and southern Denmark came the Angles and Saxons, fierce warriors who had long raided the Roman provinces. From the Jutland Peninsula came the Jutes, perhaps fewer in number, but no less determined to carve out new lives across the sea. These were not desperate refugees fleeing some great catastrophe, but rather opportunistic settlers drawn by reports of rich lands and weakened defenses. They came in their long ships, vessels capable of navigating both open seas and shallow rivers, carrying not just warriors but entire families ready to establish new communities. The men brought their weapons and their knowledge of war, the women their skills in weaving and household management, and together they carried the seeds of a new civilization. For the Jutes in particular, the southeastern coast of Britain held special appeal. Their homeland in Denmark was becoming crowded, and the success of earlier raiders had demonstrated that rich pickings awaited across the North Sea. Moreover, the Jutes had established profitable trading relationships with the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel, connections that would prove invaluable in the years to come. The climate itself seemed to favor these Germanic migrations. The 5th century was a period of relative warmth and stability, ideal for both agriculture and navigation. The same favorable winds that had carried Roman merchants to British ports now filled the sails of Germanic longships, while the mild weather made the prospect of establishing new settlements seem less daunting than it might have in harsher times. As these various pressures and opportunities converged in the early decades of the 5th century, the stage was set for one of the most significant transformations in British history. The old Roman order was dying, but what would replace it remained uncertain. Into this uncertainty would step figures like Hengist and his sons, including the young Æsc, ready to shape the future of southeastern Britain through courage, cunning, and an unwavering determination to build something lasting from the ruins of the old world. The Kentish landscape itself would bear witness to these changes. Ancient British hill forts, long abandoned, began to show signs of reoccupation as local chieftains sought defensible positions. Roman buildings were carefully dismantled, their stones repurposed for new construction projects. The great road network, though gradually deteriorating, continued to facilitate movement and communication across the region. Most significantly, the natural harbours that had served Roman commerce now welcomed a new generation of ships. Ebb's fleet, where according to later tradition Hengist and Horsa first landed, was just one of many inlets and beaches where Germanic vessels could safely approach the shore. These coastal waters, calm and sheltered by the Isle of Thanet, provided ideal conditions for the kind of gradual settlement that would characterize the Jutish occupation of Kent. In this world of transition and uncertainty, tribal loyalties and personal bonds became more important than ever. A man's worth was measured not by his Roman citizenship or his Latin education, but by his skill with sword and spear, his ability to lead followers into battle, and his success in providing protection and prosperity for his people. These were the values that young Æsc would learn at his father's side, the principles that would guide him throughout his long and successful reign. As we settle deeper into this tale of early medieval Kent, imagine the mist rolling in from the Channel on those quiet autumn evenings, bringing with it the salt scent of the sea and the whispered promises of change. Picture the ancient Roman villas standing empty in the gathering dusk, their gardens slowly returning to wildness, while in the distance, the smoke from new Germanic settlements rises straight up into the still air, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the long story of this corner of England. In the misty realm, where history fades into legend, few figures loom as large in the early medieval imagination as Hengist, the warrior chief, whose name would become synonymous with the Saxon conquest of Britain, and whose son, Æsc, would inherit not just a kingdom, but the foundation of a dynasty that would endure for centuries. The story of Hengist's arrival in Britain, as it has come down to us through the careful prose of the Venerable Bede and the terse entries of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, reads like something from an ancient saga. And perhaps that is exactly what it was. A tale told and retold around countless hearth fires until the line between historical fact and heroic legend became as soft and indistinct as morning mist over the Kentish marshes. According to these ancient sources, it was in the year 449 that two brothers, Hengist and Horsa, whose names meant stallion and horse in their native tongue, first set foot on British soil. They came not as conquerors, but as invited guests, mercenaries hired by a British king named Vortigern to help defend his realm against the savage raids of the Picts who swept down from the northern mountains like wolves in winter. The choice of these particular warriors was no accident. Hengist and Horsa were of royal blood among the Jutes, descendants of Wittgels, and inheritors of ancient rights and responsibilities that stretched back through generations of warrior kings. They possessed not only the fierce courage and tactical skill that made Germanic warriors so feared throughout Europe, but also the political acumen and natural authority that marked them as leaders of men. Vortigern, sometimes called the High King of the Britons, faced a dilemma familiar to rulers throughout history. His kingdom was under threat, but his own forces were insufficient to meet the challenge. The Roman legions that had once protected Britain were long gone, recalled to defend the empire's crumbling frontiers in Gaul and along the Rhine. The local militias that had replaced them were brave enough, but they lacked the professional discipline and military experience to stand against the hardened warriors who came raiding from beyond Hadrian's Wall. Germanic mercenaries, on the other hand, were renowned throughout Europe for their martial prowess. They had served with distinction in Roman armies for generations, their loyalty secured by generous pay, and the promise of land grants upon retirement. For Vortigern, hiring such men seemed like an elegant solution to his defensive problems. He would gain experienced warriors to protect his borders, while the mercenaries would receive payment and perhaps the opportunity to settle permanently in his realm. The agreement struck between Vortigern and the brothers seems to have been both generous and far-sighted. In exchange for their military service, Hengist and Horsa were granted land on the Isle of Thanet, that fertile island off the Kentish coast. that was separated from the mainland by the Wansum Channel. This was rich agricultural territory, well positioned for both defense and trade, and it provided the Germanic newcomers with a secure base from which to operate. From a strategic perspective, Thanet was an inspired choice. The island could be easily defended against attack from the mainland, while its position gave the Jutish warriors quick access to the sea lanes that connected Britain with the Germanic homelands across the North Sea. Should reinforcements be needed, or should retreat become necessary, ships could be launched from Thanet's beaches with minimal risk of interference from hostile forces. But Hengist and Horsa were thinking far beyond mere military service. They were experienced warriors in their prime, men who had likely participated in raids and campaigns throughout the North Sea region, and they possessed the kind of strategic vision that separated successful war leaders from mere fighters. They saw in Vortigern's offer not just temporary employment, but the potential foundation for something much grander, a permanent Germanic presence in one of Europe's richest and most strategically important islands. The initial campaign against the Picts appears to have been a stunning success. The chronicle records that the Germanic mercenaries not only defeated their enemies in battle, but drove them back so thoroughly that the northern threat was neutralized for a generation. This victory established Hengist and Horsa as valuable allies and demonstrated to other British kings the effectiveness of Germanic military methods. More importantly for the future, the success of this first campaign created a demand for additional Germanic warriors. Word spread across the North Sea that Britain offered opportunities for military service, generous land grants, and the chance to carve out new lives in a wealthy and fertile territory. Ship after ship began arriving at Thanet, bringing not just warriors, but entire families ready to settle permanently in their new homeland. Among these newcomers was Hengist's young son, Æsc, probably still in his teens, but already showing the qualities that would one day make him a great king. Raised in the warrior tradition of his people, Æsc had been trained from childhood in the arts of war and leadership. He could handle sword and spear with deadly skill, but more importantly, he possessed the political intelligence and natural charisma that would enable him to unite the fractious Jutish settlers under his rule. The relationship between the British King Vortigern and his Germanic allies was complex and often misunderstood by later chroniclers. This was not a simple case of British naivety being exploited by Germanic cunning, but rather a sophisticated political arrangement that made sense to all parties involved. Vortigern gained effective military protection for his kingdom, while Hengist secured a foothold in Britain that could be expanded when circumstances permitted. The cultural exchange that took place during these early years of cooperation was equally significant. The Germanic settlers learned about British agricultural techniques, trade networks, and administrative systems, knowledge that would prove invaluable when they eventually established their own kingdoms. Meanwhile, British elites were exposed to Germanic military technology and tactical innovations that would influence their own military development. Marriage alliances further complicated and strengthened these relationships. According to later traditions, Vortigern himself married Hengist's daughter Rowena, a union that symbolized the growing integration between British and Germanic political systems. Such marriages were common diplomatic tools in early medieval Europe, creating bonds of kinship that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. As Æsc grew to manhood in this environment of cautious cooperation and gradual integration, he would have been exposed to the best of both worlds. From his Germanic heritage, he inherited the warrior traditions and tribal loyalties that bound his people together. From his contact with Romano-British civilization, he gained an appreciation for the benefits of trade, urban life, and sophisticated administrative systems. The Isle of Thanet, during these years, must have been a fascinating place, a cultural crossroads where Germanic and British traditions mingled and evolved. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Jutish settlers adapted readily to their new environment, adopting some British customs while maintaining their own distinctive identity. Pottery styles, burial practices, and settlement patterns all show this complex process of cultural fusion. Trade, in particular, flourished under the new arrangements. Thanet's position at the mouth of the Thames gave the Jutish settlers access to London and the rich agricultural territories of the Thames Valley, while their connections across the North Sea opened new markets for British goods in Germania and Scandinavia. This commercial prosperity would become one of the defining characteristics of Æsc's later kingdom. The religious landscape, too, was evolving during these crucial years. While most of the Germanic settlers remained faithful to their traditional gods, Woden, Thuna, and Frigg, they showed a pragmatic tolerance for the Christian beliefs of their British neighbours. This religious flexibility would prove crucial in later years when Kent became the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom to embrace Christianity. As we follow young Æsc through these formative years, picture him learning the arts of kingship at his father's side, observing how Hengist balanced the competing demands of his Germanic followers and his British allies. These lessons in diplomacy and statecraft would serve him well in the challenging years ahead, when the delicate balance between cooperation and conquest would finally tip toward outright war. The stage was being set for events that would transform not just Kent, but all of Britain. The Germanic settlers were growing in numbers and confidence, while their British hosts were beginning to question whether their invited guests might be becoming unwelcome conquerors. In this atmosphere of growing tension, the political skills that Æsc was developing would soon be put to their ultimate test. The year 455 marked a turning point in the history of early medieval Britain, a moment when the carefully maintained balance between Germanic settlers and their British hosts finally collapsed into open warfare, forever altering the destiny of southeastern England and setting the stage for Æsc's eventual rise to the throne of Kent. The immediate cause of this conflict remained shrouded in the mists of time, but the underlying tensions had been building for years like pressure behind a dam. The Germanic population on Thanet and the surrounding territories had grown substantially since Hengist and Horsa's first arrival, swelled by the constant influx of new settlers drawn by reports of rich lands and generous treatment. What had begun as a relatively small force of professional mercenaries had evolved into a substantial Germanic community with its own interests and ambitions. From the British perspective, these developments must have appeared increasingly alarming. Vortigern's original agreement had called for a limited number of Germanic warriors to serve as auxiliary troops in specific military campaigns. Instead, he found himself hosting what amounted to a Germanic colony that showed no signs of returning to its homeland. The settlers were clearing new lands, establishing permanent settlements, and bringing over their families in ever-increasing numbers. Political dynamics within the British kingdoms were also shifting in ways that made conflict more likely. Vortigern's authority as High King was being challenged by rivals who questioned his wisdom in inviting Germanic settlers into Britain in the first place. Chief among these critics was his own son, Vortimer, who had emerged as the leader of a faction that favoured driving the Germanic settlers out of Britain entirely. The breaking point came when tensions over land rights, tribute payments, and political autonomy finally erupted into open violence. The exact sequence of events is unclear from our surviving sources, but it appears that disputes over the expansion of Germanic settlements beyond their original territories provided the spark that ignited a much larger conflagration. Hengist and Horsa, despite their years of faithful service to Vortigern, found themselves branded as threats to British independence. The generous hosts who had once welcomed them as allies now viewed them as dangerous invaders who had abused British hospitality. For their part, the Germanic leaders argued that they had fulfilled their original agreements and deserved recognition as permanent residents with rights to the lands they had been granted. The battle itself took place at Aylesford, a site that later chroniclers would identify as Aylesford on the River Medway in Kent. This location was strategically significant, controlling one of the main crossing points over the Medway and providing access to the rich agricultural lands of the Kentish interior. Control of this position would determine whether the Germanic settlers could expand beyond their coastal enclaves or would be confined to their original island grants. On a misty morning in 455, the two armies faced each other across the waters of the Medway, their weapons glinting in the pale sunlight that filtered through the clouds. The British forces, led by Vortimer and his war band, represented the old Romano-British military tradition, with disciplined infantry formations and cavalry units that recalled the legendary efficiency of the Roman legions. Their shields bore the dragon symbols of their royal houses, and their battle cries echoed with invocations of ancient British gods and heroes. Opposite them, the Germanic war bands presented a very different spectacle. These were warriors in the heroic tradition of their ancestors, men who had crossed the cold North Sea seeking fame and fortune in foreign lands. Their round shields and leaf-shaped spears marked them as inheritors of tactical traditions that stretched back to the forests of Germania, while their distinctive angular helmets and pattern-welded swords spoke of a warrior culture that prized individual courage above disciplined formations. Young Æsc stood among his father's warriors that morning, probably serving in the front rank of the Jutish battle line, where he could prove his courage and gain experience in the deadly art of hand-to-hand combat. At perhaps 20 years of age, he was entering the period when Germanic warriors traditionally established their reputations through acts of valor in battle. This would be his first major engagement, the crucible in which his future leadership would be forged. The battle began with the traditional exchange of spears and arrows, as both sides sought to weaken their enemies before the final clash of shield walls. The air filled with the whistle of missiles and the sharp crack of spear points striking wooden shields, while warriors on both sides called out challenges and boasts to their opponents across the field. When the two shield walls finally met, the collision was like thunder rolling across the Kentish countryside. Spear points sought gaps in enemy armor, swords rose and fell in deadly arcs, and the wounded cried out in pain and rage. The outcome of such battles often depended as much on psychological factors as physical ones. Which side could maintain its cohesion longest? Which warriors would stand firm when their comrades began to fall? For hours the struggle continued, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The British forces fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland, while the Germanic warriors battled with the fury of settlers protecting their new lives and families. The ground between the armies grew slick with blood, and the cries of the wounded mingled with the clash of weapons and the shouts of encouragement from both sides. It was during the height of this savage melee that disaster struck the Germanic cause. Horsa, the co-leader of the original expedition, and one of the most respected war chiefs among the Jutish settlers, fell beneath the weapons of his enemies. Whether he died from a spear thrust to the chest or a sword blow to the head, the sources do not tell us, but his death sent shockwaves through the Germanic battle line. The loss of a leader of Horsa's stature might have shattered the morale of a less experienced army, but the Germanic warriors had been hardened by years of campaigning, and were bound together by fierce loyalty to their surviving leaders. Hengist, despite the grief he must have felt at his brother's death, rallied his men and led them in a renewed assault that finally broke the British resistance. When the fighting ended, the field belonged to the Germanic victors, but the cost had been terrible on both sides. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's laconic entry for this year records that 12 British ealdormen fell in the battle, along with one Germanic thane named Whipt, possibly a kinsman of Horsa, whose name has been preserved by chance rather than design. These casualty figures, modest by the standards of later medieval battles, reflect the relatively small scale of early Anglo-Saxon warfare, where battles were often decided by the death or flight of a few dozen key warriors. For Æsc, the Battle of Aylesford represented both triumph and tragedy. He had proven his courage in his first major battle and had seen his father's forces achieve a decisive victory over their British enemies. But he had also witnessed the death of his uncle Horsa, a loss that would have profound implications for the future of the Germanic settlement in Kent. Horsa's death meant that Hengist was now the sole leader of the Jutish community, a development that simplified military command, but also concentrated enormous responsibility on the shoulders of a single man. For Æsc, it meant that he was now his father's principal heir and likely successor, with all the burdens and opportunities that such a position entailed. The aftermath of the battle saw significant changes in the political landscape of southeastern Britain. The British forces, though defeated, had not been completely destroyed, and they withdrew to regroup in the territories beyond Germanic control. This created a situation of ongoing conflict that would continue for years, with neither side strong enough to achieve complete victory over the other. For the Germanic settlers, the victory at Aylesford confirmed their ability to defend their territorial gains against British attempts at reconquest, but it also marked the end of their status as invited mercenaries and the beginning of their transformation into a conquering people who would take by force what they could not obtain through negotiation. The burial of Horsa became the occasion for elaborate funeral rites that demonstrated the Germanic settlers' intention to remain permanently in their adopted homeland. According to later traditions, he was buried in a great mound that could be seen for miles around, serving as both a memorial to a fallen hero and a statement of Germanic territorial claims. As evening fell over the battlefield and the survivors tended to their wounded, Æsc would have had his first glimpse of the heavy responsibilities that awaited him as his father's heir. The victory at Aylesford had secured the Germanic foothold in Kent, but it had also ensured that future expansion would come only through conquest rather than negotiation. The age of cooperation between Germanic settlers and British hosts was drawing to a close, and the age of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was about to begin. In the aftermath of the Battle of Aylesford, as the Germanic settlers of Kent consolidated their hard-won territorial gains and prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, young Æsc began the intensive education that would prepare him for his destiny as the founding king of a dynasty that would endure for centuries. Born sometime in the 430s, Æsc had spent his childhood in the unique environment of early Germanic settlement in Britain, where the traditional ways of his Jutish ancestors were slowly adapting to the realities of life in a new land. Unlike the princes of established kingdoms, who grew up surrounded by the comfortable certainties of inherited power, Æsc's education took place in the dynamic and often dangerous world of a warrior community that was still carving out its place in the political landscape of post-Roman Britain. His earliest memories would have been shaped by the sounds and sights of a military camp, gradually transforming into a permanent settlement. The ring of hammer on anvil as weapons were forged and repaired, the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep brought over from the Germanic homelands, the voices of women calling to their children in the musical cadences of the Jutish language. All of these formed the background of his formative years. Germanic society placed enormous emphasis on the training of young warriors, and Æsc's education began early, and proceeded along lines that had been established by countless generations of his ancestors. Physical training formed the foundation of this education, as boys were expected to develop the strength, speed, and endurance that would serve them in battle. From dawn to dusk, Æsc would have practiced with wooden swords and leather shields, learning the basic movements and techniques that might one day save his life in combat. But Æsc's training went far beyond mere physical preparation. As the son of Hengist, one of the most important war leaders among the Germanic settlers, he was being groomed for leadership from an early age. This meant learning not just how to fight, but how to inspire others to fight, how to make tactical decisions under pressure, and how to balance the competing demands of different factions within the Jutish community. The Germanic concept of kingship differed significantly from the Roman model that still influenced British political thought. Germanic kings were not distant autocrats ruling through elaborate bureaucracies, but war leaders who maintained their authority through personal courage, generosity to their followers, and success in battle. A king who could not lead his warriors to victory, or who failed to reward their loyalty with gifts of gold and land, would quickly find himself abandoned by his supporters. Hengist, as an experienced war leader who had successfully established his people in a new homeland, provided an excellent model for his son to study. Æsc would have observed how his father balanced firmness with flexibility, how he maintained discipline among his warriors, while also encouraging their initiative and creativity. Most importantly, he would have learned the crucial lesson that a king's authority ultimately depended on his ability to serve the interests of his people. The religious education that Æsc received was typical of Germanic noble families of this period. The Jutes, like most Germanic peoples, worshipped a pantheon of gods led by Woden, the one-eyed god of war and wisdom, who was said to gather the souls of brave warriors to his hall in Asgard. Thor, the thunder god, who wielded a mighty hammer against the forces of chaos, was particularly revered by warriors, while Frigg, the goddess of marriage and fertility, watched over families and households. But Æsc's religious education also included exposure to the Christian beliefs that were widespread among the Romano-British population of Kent. This was not unusual in the cosmopolitan environment of early medieval Europe, where warriors and traders regularly encountered different religious traditions. The practical benefits of religious tolerance were obvious to leaders like Hengist, who needed to maintain peaceful relationships with British Christian communities while preserving the loyalty of their own predominantly pagan followers. The art of warfare in this period was far more complex than modern popular culture often suggests. Successful war leaders needed to understand not just individual combat techniques, but also the coordination of different types of warriors, the logistics of maintaining armies in the field, and the psychological factors that determined victory or defeat in battle. Æsc learned these lessons through careful observation of his father's military campaigns and through increasingly responsible roles in the planning and execution of military operations. Weapons training formed a central part of this military education. The spear was the primary weapon of Germanic warriors, valued for its versatility in both mounted and foot combat. Æsc would have spent countless hours learning to thrust and parry with different types of spears, from light javelins suitable for throwing to heavy war spears designed for close combat. The sword, though more expensive and therefore more prestigious, was considered the weapon of nobles and proven warriors, and Æsc would have received intensive training in swordplay, as befitted his royal status. Shield work was equally important, as Germanic tactics relied heavily on the disciplined coordination of warriors fighting in close formation. The round shields carried by Jutish warriors were not just defensive tools, but active weapons that could be used to strike enemies or to lock together in the famous shield wall formation that made Germanic infantry so formidable. Æsc learned to fight both as an individual warrior and as part of these larger tactical formations. The political dimensions of Æsc's education were perhaps even more important than his military training. Germanic society was intensely hierarchical, but it was also surprisingly democratic in many ways. Major decisions were made by assemblies of free warriors who could voice their opinions and influence their leaders' choices. A successful king needed to be able to persuade as well as command, to build consensus among his followers, rather than simply imposing his will through force. Æsc observed his father navigating these complex political waters, learning how to balance the competing interests of different warrior bands, how to distribute the spoils of war fairly among his followers, and how to maintain alliances with other Germanic leaders while preserving his own independence of action. These lessons in political management would prove crucial when Æsc eventually inherited the leadership of the Kentish settlement. Trade and commerce also played important roles in Æsc's education. The Germanic settlers in Kent were not simply raiders or subsistence farmers, but participants in the complex trading networks that connected Britain with the continent. Æsc learned about the movement of goods across the North Sea, the relative values of different commodities, and the diplomatic relationships that made profitable trade possible. The establishment of peaceful relations with Frankish merchants was particularly important for the future prosperity of Kent. The Franks controlled much of the European coast opposite Britain, and their kingdom was rapidly becoming one of the most powerful political entities in post-Roman Europe. By maintaining good relationships with Frankish traders and nobles, the Kentish settlers could access continental markets for their agricultural products, while importing the luxury goods and raw materials that their growing community required. Language skills were another crucial component of Æsc's education. While Jutish remained the primary language of the Germanic settlers, knowledge of British Celtic dialects and Latin was essential for anyone who hoped to play a significant role in the broader political and economic life of post-Roman Britain. Æsc probably acquired at least basic competency in these languages, enabling him to communicate directly with British nobles and merchants without relying on interpreters. As Æsc progressed through his teenage years, his father began giving him increasing responsibility for various aspects of the Kentish settlement's administration. This practical experience complemented his formal education and provided him with first-hand knowledge of the challenges facing Germanic leaders in Britain. Whether organizing the distribution of captured lands among new settlers, negotiating trading agreements with British merchants, or planning defensive measures against potential British attacks, Æsc gained valuable experience in the day-to-day business of leadership. The warrior culture of the Germanic peoples placed great emphasis on honor, loyalty, and personal reputation. Æsc learned that a king's word was his bond, that promises made to followers must be kept regardless of personal cost, and that cowardice or betrayal could destroy a leader's authority more quickly than any military defeat. These values would shape his approach to kingship throughout his long reign. By the time Æsc reached his early 20s, he had completed an education that combined practical military training with sophisticated political instruction. He was ready to take on greater responsibilities within the Kentish settlement and to begin establishing his own reputation as a leader worthy of his father's legacy. The foundations had been laid for what would become one of the most successful and enduring royal dynasties in early medieval Europe. The passing of power from Hengist to his son Æsc represents one of the most significant transitions in early Anglo-Saxon history, marking the moment when a collection of Germanic war bands evolved into a structured kingdom with hereditary succession and established institutions. This transformation, which took place sometime in the late 480s, would set the pattern for royal succession throughout the Anglo-Saxon period and establish the foundations upon which medieval English kingship would be built. Unlike the dramatic power struggles that characterized many early medieval successions, the transition from Hengist to Æsc appears to have been remarkably smooth and peaceful. This smoothness was not accidental, but rather the result of careful planning and preparation that stretched back over many years. Hengist, as an experienced war leader who had successfully established his people in a foreign land, understood the importance of ensuring stable succession and had worked diligently to prepare his son for the responsibilities of leadership. The process began long before Hengist's actual death, as the aging king gradually transferred more and more authority to his designated heir. By the early 480s, Æsc was already functioning as his father's chief lieutenant, responsible for military operations, diplomatic negotiations, and the administration of the expanding Kentish territories. This gradual transition allowed Æsc to establish his own relationships with key supporters, while maintaining continuity with his father's policies and approaches. Germanic succession customs provided the framework within which this transition took place. Unlike Roman or Byzantine practices that emphasized formal legal procedures, Germanic succession was based on a combination of hereditary right, personal charisma, and the consent of the warrior class. A king's son might have a strong claim to succeed his father, but that claim had to be validated by his ability to command respect and loyalty from the community's warriors and nobles. Æsc's preparation for kingship had included careful cultivation of relationships with the various warrior bands that made up the Kentish settlement. These groups, originally drawn from different regions of Jutland and the neighbouring territories, maintained their own identities and loyalties even after settling in Britain. A successful king needed to balance these competing interests while maintaining the overall unity of the Germanic community. The religious dimensions of royal succession were equally important in Germanic society. Kings were believed to possess a special relationship with the gods, particularly Woden, the divine ancestor of many royal dynasties. This sacred aspect of kingship was symbolized through elaborate rituals and ceremonies that marked the transfer of power from one generation to the next. Æsc's inauguration as king would have involved oaths sworn before the traditional gods of his people, reinforcing his legitimacy in both human and divine terms. The timing of Hengist's death was particularly significant for the future of the Kentish kingdom. By the late 480s, the Germanic settlement had achieved a degree of stability and prosperity that would have been unimaginable during the chaotic years following the Battle of Aylesford. The immediate military threats that had dominated the early years of settlement had been largely neutralized, allowing attention to turn to the challenges of peaceful governance and economic development. Archaeological evidence from this period suggests that the Kentish settlement was experiencing rapid growth and increasing sophistication. New villages were being established throughout the territory, agricultural production was expanding, and trade networks were developing that connected Kent with both continental Europe and other parts of Britain. This prosperity provided Æsc with resources that his father had never enjoyed, and created new opportunities for the expansion of royal power. The actual circumstances of Hengist's death remain obscure, as was common with early medieval sources that often focused more on the heroic aspects of a ruler's life than on the mundane details of his passing. What seems clear is that he died peacefully, probably in the early months of 488, at an advanced age for someone who had lived through decades of warfare and political upheaval. His death marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in the history of Germanic settlement in Britain. The funeral rites that marked Hengist's passing would have been among the most elaborate ceremonies ever witnessed in Kent up to that time. Germanic funeral customs emphasized the dead warrior's journey to the afterlife and his continued connection with his living descendants. Hengist was probably buried with his weapons, jewelry, and other personal possessions, surrounded by grave goods that reflected his status as king and war leader. More importantly for the future of the kingdom, Hengist's funeral provided an opportunity for Æsc to demonstrate his own fitness for royal authority. Germanic kings were expected to display their generosity through elaborate gift-giving, and Æsc would have used this occasion to distribute valuable presents to his supporters, reinforcing their loyalty and establishing his reputation as a worthy successor to his father's legacy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's terse entry for 488, here Æsc succeeded to the kingdom and was king of the Kentish men 24 winters, captures the essential facts of this transition while concealing the complex political and social processes that made it possible. This brevity was typical of early medieval chroniclers, who often took for granted the cultural context that gave meaning to political events. For the broader Germanic community in Kent, Æsc's accession represented both continuity and change. Continuity was provided by his family connections to Hengist and his deep involvement in the policies and decisions of the previous reign. Change came through Æsc's own personality and vision, which would shape the kingdom's development in directions that reflected his particular interests and priorities. One of Æsc's first challenges as king was to establish his authority over the various subgroups within the Kentish settlement. While his succession had been peaceful, he still needed to demonstrate that he possessed the military skill, political acumen, and personal charisma necessary to maintain unity among his diverse followers. This required a delicate balance between firmness and flexibility, as Æsc worked to establish his own leadership style while maintaining the loyalty of warriors who had served his father for decades. The international dimensions of Æsc's succession were equally significant. The Kentish kingdom existed within a complex web of relationships that connected it to other Germanic settlements in Britain, to the remaining British kingdoms that still controlled much of the island, and to the powerful Frankish kingdom across the Channel. Æsc's ability to navigate these relationships successfully would largely determine the future prosperity and security of his realm. Continental connections were particularly important for Kent's long-term development. The Frankish kingdoms were rapidly becoming the dominant power in Western Europe, and their friendship could provide crucial military and economic advantages. Æsc's maintenance of the trading relationships that his father had established with Frankish merchants would prove essential to Kent's prosperity in the decades ahead. The establishment of Æsc's royal authority also required attention to the internal development of the kingdom. This meant not just military leadership, but also the creation of legal and administrative systems that could maintain order and resolve disputes peacefully. Germanic law was traditionally based on custom and precedent rather than written codes, but the complexity of governing a settled population required more sophisticated legal procedures than had been necessary during the period of initial conquest. As Æsc settled into his role as king, he would have been conscious of the weight of expectations that rested on his shoulders. He was not just inheriting his father's throne, but also the responsibility for ensuring the continued survival and prosperity of the Germanic community that Hengist had worked so hard to establish. The success or failure of his reign would determine whether the Kentish settlement would flourish as an independent kingdom or gradually fade into obscurity. Like so many other early medieval political experiments, the stage was now set for Æsc to begin the work of transforming a collection of Germanic settlements into a unified and prosperous kingdom. The foundations laid by his father provided him with valuable resources and established relationships, but the ultimate success of the Kentish experiment would depend on his ability to build upon these foundations and adapt them to the changing circumstances of late 5th and early 6th century Britain. With the crown of Kent now resting upon his brow, King Æsc faced the monumental task of transforming what had been essentially a collection of Germanic war bands and settlements into a unified and prosperous kingdom capable of taking its place among the emerging powers of early medieval Europe. The years following his accession in 488 would prove to be among the most crucial in the history of Anglo-Saxon England, as the foundations were laid for institutions and practices that would endure for centuries. The first challenge confronting the new king was the establishment of effective royal authority throughout the territories under Kentish control. While Æsc had inherited his father's throne through legitimate succession, kingship in Germanic society was not merely a matter of bloodline, but required the active consent and support of the warrior class. Each village, each war band, each extended family group within the Kentish settlement needed to be convinced that Æsc possessed the wisdom, courage, and generosity necessary to serve as their leader. This process of establishing royal legitimacy was accomplished through a combination of traditional ceremonies, practical demonstrations of leadership, and careful attention to the distribution of rewards and responsibilities among his supporters. Æsc embarked upon a series of royal progresses throughout his kingdom, visiting each major settlement in turn to receive the formal submission of local leaders and to address any concerns or grievances that had arisen during the transition period. These royal visits served multiple purposes beyond the purely ceremonial. They allowed Æsc to assess the condition of his territories firsthand, to identify potential problems before they became serious threats, and to strengthen personal relationships with the local nobles and war leaders, whose support was essential to effective governance. The generous hospitality that Æsc showed during these visits, and the valuable gifts that he distributed to loyal supporters, helped to establish his reputation as a king worthy of service and devotion. The geographic extent of Æsc's kingdom at the time of his accession represented a significant expansion from the original Jutish settlement on the Isle of Thanet. Through a combination of military conquest, peaceful negotiation, and gradual settlement, Germanic control had spread throughout what is now eastern Kent, including the important strategic centres of Canterbury and Rochester. This expansion had brought the Kentish kingdom into contact with a diverse population that included not only Germanic settlers, but also Romano-British communities that had chosen to remain under Jutish rule. The integration of these different populations represented one of Æsc's most significant challenges and greatest achievements. Unlike some other Germanic kingdoms that relied primarily on military dominance to control conquered territories, Kent, under Æsc's leadership, developed a more sophisticated approach that combined respect for local customs with gradual assimilation into Germanic political and social structures. The Romano-British population of Kent possessed valuable skills and knowledge that Æsc was eager to preserve and utilize. Their experience with sophisticated agricultural techniques, urban administration, and international trade could contribute significantly to the kingdom's prosperity if properly managed. Rather than simply displacing these communities, Æsc pursued policies designed to incorporate their expertise while maintaining overall Germanic control. This approach to governance required the development of new administrative structures that could accommodate the diverse needs of Æsc's subjects. Traditional Germanic political organization, based on personal loyalty between war leaders and their followers, needed to be adapted to govern settled agricultural communities with complex economic and social relationships. Æsc began the process of creating more formal governmental institutions while preserving the personal bonds that remained central to Germanic political culture. The establishment of royal law represented a crucial aspect of this institutional development. Germanic society had traditionally relied on customary law administered by local assemblies, but the complexity of governing a diverse population required more centralized legal authority. Æsc and his advisors began developing legal procedures that combined traditional Germanic customs with practical innovations suited to local conditions in Kent. Land tenure emerged as one of the most complex legal and political issues facing the new kingdom. The original Germanic settlers had received land grants from Hengist as rewards for military service, but the expansion of the kingdom had created a patchwork of different landholding arrangements. Some territories had been acquired through conquest and were held directly by the crown, while others had been settled through negotiation with British communities that retained certain traditional rights. Æsc's approach to these land tenure issues demonstrated his political sophistication and long-term vision. Rather than attempting to impose a uniform system throughout his kingdom, he chose to recognize and work within existing arrangements while gradually encouraging standardization where possible. This flexible approach helped to minimize conflicts while preserving the social stability that was essential to economic development. The economic foundations of Æsc's kingdom were remarkably diverse for such an early medieval polity. Agriculture remained the backbone of the economy, but Kent's strategic position and established trading relationships provided opportunities for commercial development that were unavailable to most other Germanic kingdoms. The fertile soils of the Kentish countryside proved well suited to the agricultural techniques that the Jutish settlers had brought from their homeland, while the existing network of Roman roads facilitated the transport of goods to markets throughout southern Britain. Trade relationships with continental Europe were particularly important to Kent's prosperity during this period. The kingdom's location directly across the Channel from the emerging Frankish Empire provided unique opportunities for commercial exchange. Kentish merchants could export agricultural products, particularly grain and wool, in exchange for luxury goods, raw materials, and manufactured items that were not readily available in Britain. Æsc's personal involvement in the development of these trading relationships demonstrated his understanding of their importance to his kingdom's future. Unlike some Germanic kings who viewed commerce as beneath royal dignity, Æsc actively encouraged trade and provided protection for merchants operating within his territories. This royal support helped to establish Kent's reputation as a safe and profitable destination for continental traders. The development of urban centers represented another significant achievement of Æsc's early reign. Canterbury, the former Roman city of Duravernum, experienced a remarkable revival under Kentish rule, as Æsc invested resources in rebuilding and expanding the settlement. The city's strategic location at the intersection of major roads made it an ideal center for both governmental administration and commercial activity. Rochester, controlling the important crossing of the River Medway, also benefited from royal attention during this period. Æsc recognized the strategic importance of this position for controlling access to the Kentish interior and invested in fortifications and infrastructure that would secure the kingdom's northern approaches while facilitating legitimate trade and travel. The military organization of Æsc's kingdom reflected both traditional Germanic practices and innovations necessitated by changing circumstances. The core of the royal army remained the personal war bands of the king and his principal nobles, but these forces were supplemented by local militias drawn from the general population. This mixed system provided flexibility in responding to different types of military challenges, while maintaining the personal bonds between leaders and followers that were central to Germanic military culture. Defensive preparations received particular attention during the early years of Æsc's reign. While the immediate threats from British kingdoms had been largely neutralized, the possibility of renewed conflict remained significant. Æsc invested in the construction and repair of fortifications at key strategic points throughout his territory, creating a defensive network that could protect the kingdom's population and economic resources in the event of renewed warfare. The religious landscape of Kent during this period reflected the complex cultural mixture that characterized the kingdom more generally. While Æsc and most of his Germanic followers remained loyal to their traditional gods. They showed remarkable tolerance for the Christian beliefs that were widespread among the Romano-British population. This religious tolerance was not merely a matter of political expediency, but reflected a genuine appreciation for the diversity that contributed to the kingdom's strength and prosperity. As Æsc's reign progressed through its first decade, the success of his policies became increasingly apparent. The kingdom enjoyed internal peace and external security. The economy flourished, and the population grew steadily through both natural increase and continued immigration from the Germanic homelands. The foundations had been laid for what would become one of the most successful and enduring kingdoms in early medieval Europe. Under King Æsc's wise and far-sighted leadership, the Kingdom of Kent emerged as the most prosperous and commercially sophisticated realm in early Anglo-Saxon Britain. Its wealth built upon a foundation of strategic geography, diplomatic acumen, and entrepreneurial innovation that would serve as a model for medieval kingdoms throughout Europe. The geographic advantages that made Kent ideally suited for commercial development were recognized and exploited with remarkable skill during Æsc's reign. The kingdom's position as the closest point of contact between Britain and continental Europe provided natural opportunities for trade, but it was Æsc's political and economic policies that transformed these opportunities into sustained prosperity for his people. The English Channel, which had once served as a barrier protecting Britain from continental invasions, now became a highway facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and culture between the Kentish kingdom and its European neighbours. The kingdom's numerous natural harbours, from the sheltered waters around the Isle of Thanet to the deeper ports at Dover and Folkestone, provided excellent facilities for the types of vessels that dominated early medieval commerce. Æsc's approach to trade policy demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of economic principles that was unusual among early medieval rulers. Rather than viewing commerce as simply another source of royal revenue to be taxed and regulated, he recognized that trade could serve as an engine of general prosperity that would benefit all levels of society. This understanding led him to adopt policies that encouraged commercial activity, while providing the security and legal framework necessary for business to flourish. The relationship between Kent and the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel formed the cornerstone of the kingdom's commercial prosperity. The Franks, under the leadership of ambitious kings like Clovis, were rapidly expanding their territory and consolidating their control over much of what had been Roman Gaul. This expansion created new markets for British goods, while providing sources of continental products that were in high demand among the increasingly sophisticated population of Kent. Æsc's personal diplomacy played a crucial role in maintaining and strengthening these cross-channel relationships. Unlike many Germanic kings who maintained their authority primarily through military prowess, Æsc understood the importance of peaceful diplomatic relations in securing long-term prosperity. He exchanged embassies with Frankish kings, negotiated commercial treaties, and even arranged marriage alliances that cemented political relationships while opening new opportunities for trade. The goods that flowed through Kentish ports during this period reflected both the agricultural abundance of the kingdom and its growing sophistication in craft production. Kent's fertile soils, worked by farmers who combined traditional Germanic techniques with innovations learned from Romano-British communities, produced substantial surpluses of grain that found ready markets in continental Europe. The kingdom's sheep provided high-quality wool that was particularly prized by Frankish textile producers. In addition to these agricultural exports, Kent developed a reputation for the production of luxury goods that reflected the kingdom's growing wealth and cultural sophistication. Kentish jewelers created elaborate brooches and personal ornaments that combined Germanic artistic traditions with techniques learned from Romano-British craftsmen. These items were not only treasured by the Kentish nobility, but also found markets among the aristocratic classes of neighbouring kingdoms. The import trade was equally important to Kent's prosperity and development. Continental merchants brought luxury goods that enhanced the lifestyle of the kingdom's elite, while also providing raw materials and tools that contributed to economic development. Wine from Frankish vineyards graced the tables of Kentish nobles, while continental metalworkers provided weapons and tools that were superior to those produced locally. Perhaps most significantly, the trade relationships established during Æsc's reign brought new ideas and technologies to Kent that accelerated the kingdom's cultural and economic development. Continental craftsmen who settled in Kentish towns brought advanced techniques in metalworking, pottery production, and textile manufacture. These skills were gradually disseminated throughout the kingdom, raising the general level of technological sophistication and creating new opportunities for economic growth. The development of monetary systems represented one of the most important economic innovations of Æsc's reign. While most early Germanic kingdoms continued to rely primarily on barter and gift exchange, Kent began experimenting with standardized units of value that facilitated more complex commercial transactions. These early monetary systems, based on precious metals and standardized weights, would eventually evolve into the sophisticated coinage systems that characterized later Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Urban development flourished under the economic prosperity that characterized Æsc's reign. Canterbury, in particular, experienced remarkable growth as merchants, craftsmen, and administrators were attracted to the kingdom's primary commercial and political centre. The city's population expanded beyond the boundaries of the old Roman walls, creating new suburbs that reflected the diverse character of Kentish society. The infrastructure investments that supported this commercial prosperity required substantial royal resources and demonstrated Æsc's commitment to long-term economic development. Roads were maintained and improved to facilitate the transport of goods between production centres and ports. Harbour facilities were expanded and upgraded to accommodate the increasing volume of shipping. Market towns were established at strategic locations throughout the kingdom to serve as collection and distribution points for agricultural products. The legal framework that governed commercial activity in Kent represented a sophisticated blend of Germanic customary law and practical innovations designed to meet the needs of a trading economy. Contract enforcement, property rights, and dispute resolution procedures were all adapted to support commercial transactions while maintaining the personal relationships that remained central to Germanic social organization. The prosperity generated by trade had profound effects on Kentish society beyond the purely economic sphere. The wealth flowing into the kingdom enabled Æsc to maintain a court that rivaled those of continental European kings in its sophistication and magnificence. This royal splendor served important political purposes, demonstrating Kent's power and prosperity to potential allies and enemies, while providing rewards for loyal supporters. The distribution of this commercial wealth throughout Kentish society helped to create a level of social mobility that was unusual in early medieval Europe. Successful merchants and craftsmen could accumulate sufficient resources to purchase land and achieve noble status, while the general prosperity improved living standards for the population as a whole. This social dynamism contributed to the kingdom's stability by providing opportunities for advancement that reduced the likelihood of internal conflict. Cultural exchange accompanied commercial exchange, as traders and travelers brought new ideas and customs to Kent from throughout Europe. The kingdom became a cosmopolitan center where Germanic, Romano-British, and continental European traditions mingled and evolved. This cultural diversity enriched Kentish society while also contributing to its economic dynamism. The success of Kent's commercial policies during Æsc's reign established precedents that would influence economic development throughout Anglo-Saxon England. Other kingdoms observed Kent's prosperity and attempted to emulate its policies, creating a competitive environment that encouraged innovation and efficiency. The commercial networks established during this period would continue to operate for centuries, providing a foundation for England's eventual emergence as a major European trading power. Religious toleration played an important role in supporting Kent's commercial success. Merchants from different religious backgrounds were welcomed in Kentish ports and markets, creating an environment of openness and tolerance that facilitated business relationships. This policy would prove particularly important in later years when Christian merchants from continental Europe became increasingly active in British trade. As Æsc's reign progressed into its second decade, the foundations of lasting prosperity had been firmly established. The kingdom's wealth was no longer dependent solely on military conquest or royal patronage, but had been built upon sustainable economic activities that could continue to generate prosperity for generations to come. The commercial success achieved during this period would provide the resources necessary for Kent's continued political and cultural development in the challenging years ahead. The establishment of the Oiscingas dynasty under King Æsc represented a crucial development in the evolution of Anglo-Saxon kingship, marking the transition from charismatic war leadership to hereditary monarchy and creating institutional frameworks that would influence royal succession throughout medieval England for centuries to come. The name Oiscingas, meaning descendants of Oisc, reflected the Germanic tradition of identifying royal dynasties through their founding ancestors. By adopting this designation for his family line, Æsc was making a bold statement about his intentions for the future of Kent. He was not merely a successful war leader who happened to inherit his father's position, but rather the founder of a royal house that would endure for generations, establishing claims to legitimate authority that would be recognized by both subjects and neighboring rulers. The decision to name the dynasty after Æsc, rather than his more famous father Hengist, reveals much about the nature of royal authority in early medieval Kent. While Hengist was revered as the founder of the Germanic settlement in Britain, it was Æsc who had transformed that settlement into a true kingdom with stable institutions and established territories. The Oiscingas designation acknowledged this crucial distinction, while maintaining respect for the heroic achievements of the previous generation. Germanic concepts of royal legitimacy were complex and multifaceted, combining elements of divine sanction, hereditary right, and popular consent in ways that could seem contradictory to modern observers. Æsc's approach to establishing dynastic authority drew skillfully upon all of these sources of legitimacy, while adapting them to the particular circumstances of his kingdom. The divine aspects of Oiscingas' kingship were rooted in traditional Germanic beliefs about the special relationship between royal families and the gods. The Jutes, like most Germanic peoples, traced their royal lineages back to Woden, the chief god of their pantheon and the divine patron of warriors and kings. This connection provided sacred authorization for royal authority, while also imposing obligations on kings to maintain the favor of the gods through proper conduct and successful leadership. Hereditary succession within the Oiscingas dynasty was not simply a matter of primogeniture, as would become common in later medieval kingdoms. Germanic inheritance customs recognized the claims of all male members of the royal family, creating a system that balanced the advantages of hereditary continuity with the need to ensure that kings possessed the personal qualities necessary for effective leadership. This flexible approach to succession would prove crucial during the various crises that the dynasty would face in later generations. The role of popular consent in legitimizing Oiscingas' rule was expressed through the traditional Germanic institution of the Thing or assembly. where free warriors could voice their opinions on matters of public concern. While Æsc and his successors possessed significant authority as kings, they were expected to consult with their followers on important decisions and to govern in ways that served the general interests of the kingdom, rather than merely advancing royal prerogatives. The establishment of clear succession procedures represented one of Æsc's most important contributions to the long-term stability of his kingdom. Early Germanic societies had often suffered from succession disputes that could tear apart kingdoms and dynasties, but Æsc worked carefully to establish precedents and expectations that would minimize such conflicts in future generations. The education and preparation of potential heirs became a central concern of Oiscingas' royal policy. Sons of the royal family were given comprehensive training in military arts, political leadership, and administrative skills that would prepare them for the responsibilities of kingship. This educational program ensured that the dynasty would continue to produce capable rulers, while also strengthening the personal bonds between royal family members and the noble families who served as their principal supporters. Marriage alliances played a crucial role in the dynastic strategy developed by Æsc and his successors. Royal marriages were not merely personal relationships, but diplomatic instruments that could secure political alliances, guarantee treaty obligations, and create networks of kinship that extended the influence of the Kentish kingdom throughout early medieval Europe. The careful management of these marriage relationships would become one of the defining characteristics of successful Oiscingas statecraft. The development of royal ceremonial and symbolism during Æsc's reign helped to establish the dignity and authority of the new dynasty. Germanic kingship had traditionally been relatively informal, with kings distinguished from their followers more by their success in battle and their generosity in distributing rewards than by elaborate ceremonial displays. However, the establishment of a permanent kingdom required more sophisticated expressions of royal authority. Royal regalia, including crowns, scepters, and ceremonial weapons, began to appear during this period as symbols of dynastic continuity and royal authority. These objects were not merely decorative but carried deep symbolic meaning, representing the king's role as protector of his people, judge of disputes, and intermediary between the human and divine worlds. The careful preservation and transmission of these regalia from one generation to the next would become an important element in maintaining dynastic legitimacy. The establishment of royal residences and ceremonial centers also contributed to the institutionalization of Oiscingas' kingship. While early Germanic kings had typically moved from place to place with their warrior bands, the development of a settled kingdom required more permanent centers of royal authority. Canterbury emerged as the primary royal seat during Æsc's reign, with royal halls and administrative buildings that provided appropriate settings for the exercise of kingly authority. Legal and administrative developments during this period reflected the dynasty's commitment to establishing lasting institutions rather than relying solely on personal charisma and military success. The codification of laws, the establishment of royal courts, and the development of administrative procedures all contributed to creating a governmental system that could function effectively regardless of the particular strengths or weaknesses of individual rulers. The religious dimensions of dynastic legitimacy would undergo significant changes during the later history of the Oiscingas dynasty, particularly with the conversion to Christianity that would occur under Æsc's great-grandson Ethelbert. However, the foundations for these later developments were laid during Æsc's reign through policies of religious tolerance and cultural accommodation that demonstrated the dynasty's ability to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The territorial expansion that characterized much of Æsc's reign also contributed to dynastic prestige and legitimacy. Military success had always been an important source of royal authority in Germanic society, and Æsc's ability to extend Kentish control throughout southeastern Britain demonstrated the divine favour and personal competence that justified his family's claim to kingship. The economic prosperity that flourished under Oiscingas' rule provided the material foundation for dynastic power, while also creating new opportunities for the expression of royal generosity. The ability to reward followers with gold, land, and other valuable gifts remained central to Germanic concepts of successful kingship, and the commercial wealth generated by Kentish trade provided Æsc and his successors with unprecedented resources for maintaining the loyalty of their supporters. Cultural patronage emerged as another important aspect of Oiscingas' royal policy. The sponsorship of poets, craftsmen, and other cultural figures helped to create a distinctive Kentish court culture that enhanced the dynasty's prestige while preserving and developing the artistic traditions of the Germanic peoples. The oral poetry that celebrated the achievements of Æsc and his ancestors played a particularly important role in maintaining dynastic legitimacy by preserving the memory of royal accomplishments for future generations. The international recognition that the Oiscingas dynasty achieved during Æsc's reign provided crucial external validation for its claims to legitimate authority. Treaties with Frankish kings, trading agreements with continental merchants, and diplomatic exchanges with other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms all acknowledged Kent's status as an independent and sovereign realm under Oiscingas' rule. As Æsc's long reign drew toward its close, the institutional foundations of the dynasty had been firmly established. The succession procedures, ceremonial traditions, and governmental systems that he had developed would provide stability and continuity for his descendants, while maintaining sufficient flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. The Oiscingas dynasty was positioned to endure not merely as a family holding power through force, but as a legitimate royal house with deep roots in both Germanic tradition and the particular circumstances of post-Roman Britain. As the 6th century dawned across the misty hills and fertile valleys of Kent, King Æsc entered the twilight years of a reign that had already lasted longer than most men of his era could expect to live. Yet his energy and vision for his kingdom's future remained as clear and purposeful as the morning light breaking over the white cliffs of Dover. The king, who had inherited a collection of Germanic settlements scattered across southeastern Britain, had succeeded in creating something unprecedented in the post-Roman world, a stable, prosperous kingdom that combined the warrior traditions of his ancestors with the sophisticated administrative and commercial practices necessary for long-term success in an increasingly complex political environment. By the early years of the new century, Æsc's reputation extended far beyond the borders of his own kingdom. Frankish kings sought his alliance and counsel. British chieftains acknowledged his authority even when they opposed his expansion, and other Anglo-Saxon rulers looked to Kent as a model for their own state-building efforts. This international recognition represented a remarkable achievement for a dynasty that had been established only a generation earlier by a band of Germanic mercenaries. The physical transformation of Kent during Æsc's reign provided tangible evidence of the kingdom's prosperity and stability. Visitors arriving at the kingdom's ports would have been struck by the bustling commercial activity that characterized these centers of international trade. Canterbury, in particular, had grown from a half-abandoned Roman city into a thriving medieval town that rivaled anything to be found north of the Alps. The countryside, too, bore the marks of successful settlement and development. Germanic and Romano-British farmers worked side by side in fields that produced abundant harvests of grain and other crops, while sheep grazed on hillsides that would provide the raw materials for Kent's growing textile industry. Villages that had been little more than collections of rough huts in Hengist's time had evolved into substantial settlements with well-built houses, workshops, and community buildings. The social integration that had been achieved within Kentish society represented one of Æsc's most significant accomplishments. The ethnic tensions that had characterized the early years of Germanic settlement had given way to a remarkably harmonious fusion of different cultural traditions. Intermarriage between Germanic and Romano-British families had created a new generation of Kentish people who combined the best elements of both heritages. This cultural synthesis was reflected in many aspects of daily life throughout the kingdom. Artistic styles evolved that blended Germanic geometric patterns with Romano-British naturalistic motifs, creating distinctive decorative traditions that would influence Anglo-Saxon art for centuries. Architecture, too, showed this fusion, as building techniques that combined Germanic timber construction with Roman masonry created structures that were both practical and aesthetically pleasing. The legal system that Æsc had developed during his reign represented another successful synthesis of different traditions. Germanic customary law provided the foundation, but this had been adapted and expanded to meet the needs of a diverse population, engaged in increasingly complex economic and social relationships. The royal court that administered this legal system had earned a reputation for fairness and efficiency that attracted litigants from neighbouring kingdoms. Religious life in Kent during Æsc's final years reflected the tolerance and accommodation that had characterized his approach to governance throughout his reign. While the king and most of his Germanic followers remained loyal to their traditional gods, Christian communities continued to flourish under royal protection. This religious diversity had become one of Kent's distinctive characteristics, setting it apart from other kingdoms where religious uniformity was often enforced through royal authority. The question of succession occupied much of Æsc's attention during his final years, as he worked to ensure that the dynasty he had established would continue to provide effective leadership for his kingdom. Unlike many early medieval rulers who waited until their deathbeds to address succession issues, Æsc had spent years preparing his heir and establishing clear procedures for the transfer of power. The heir apparent, Octa, had been carefully groomed for kingship through extensive education and gradually increasing responsibilities within the royal administration. By the time of Æsc's final illness, Octa was already functioning as his father's principal deputy, handling many of the day-to-day responsibilities of royal governance, while his father focused on broader strategic issues. This gradual transfer of authority had several important benefits for the long-term stability of the kingdom. It allowed Octa to establish his own relationships with key supporters, while maintaining continuity with his father's policies. It also provided an opportunity to identify and address potential sources of opposition before they could develop into serious challenges to royal authority. The international dimension of succession planning was equally important. Æsc worked carefully to ensure that his heir would be recognized and accepted by the kingdom's allies and trading partners. Diplomatic missions were sent to Frankish courts and other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to introduce Octa and secure commitments of continued cooperation under his leadership. The economic foundation of the kingdom remained strong throughout Æsc's final years, providing his successor with the resources necessary to maintain the prosperity and stability that had become hallmarks of Kentish governance. Trade relationships that had been carefully developed over decades continued to flourish, while agricultural production reached new levels of efficiency and abundance. The military organization of the kingdom had also been modernized and strengthened during Æsc's reign. While maintaining the personal bonds between leaders and followers that remained central to Germanic military culture, the royal army had adopted new tactics and technologies that reflected the changing nature of warfare in early medieval Europe. These military innovations would prove crucial for defending the kingdom against future challenges. The cultural achievements of Æsc's reign provided another important element of his legacy. The royal court had become a center of learning and artistic achievement that attracted scholars, poets, and craftsmen from throughout Europe. The literary works produced under royal patronage preserved and celebrated Germanic heroic traditions, while also recording contemporary achievements for future generations. The legal and administrative institutions that Æsc had established represented perhaps his most enduring contribution to the development of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The procedures for royal governance, legal administration, and economic regulation that had been developed in Kent would serve as models for other kingdoms throughout England, contributing to the gradual emergence of common institutions and practices that would eventually facilitate political unification. The diplomatic relationships that Æsc had cultivated throughout his reign had established Kent as a major player in the complex international system of early medieval Europe. These relationships would continue to provide benefits for his successors, while also imposing obligations to maintain the standards of governance and reliability that had earned the kingdom its reputation. As Æsc contemplated the approaching end of his long and successful reign, he could take satisfaction in knowing that he had accomplished far more than anyone could have expected when he inherited the throne from his father. The kingdom he was preparing to leave to his successor was prosperous, stable, and respected throughout Europe. The dynasty he had established possessed the institutional foundations necessary for long-term survival and success. The transformation that had occurred during Æsc's reign extended far beyond the borders of Kent itself. The model of successful state-building that he had provided would influence the development of other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for generations to come. The commercial and diplomatic networks that he had established would continue to shape the economic and political development of early medieval Britain. Perhaps most importantly, Æsc had demonstrated that Germanic peoples could successfully adapt to the challenges of ruling settled populations in complex societies. The synthesis of Germanic warrior traditions with Romano-British administrative and commercial practices that he had achieved in Kent provided a template for the cultural fusion that would eventually create medieval English civilization. As the great king prepared for his final journey to the halls of his ancestors, the kingdom he had built stood as a testament to the vision, courage, and wisdom that had characterized his long and remarkable reign. The foundations he had laid would support the continued prosperity and development of Kent for centuries to come, while his example would inspire future generations of Anglo-Saxon rulers throughout England. In the year 512, as autumn mists began to gather across the fertile fields of Kent, and the first chill winds of winter whispered through the ancient oaks that dotted the countryside, the long and remarkable reign of King Æsc drew peacefully to its close, marking the end of an era that had seen the transformation of southeastern Britain from a collection of war-torn territories into one of the most prosperous and stable kingdoms in early medieval Europe. The circumstances surrounding Æsc's final days were characteristic of the dignity and thoughtfulness that had marked his entire approach to kingship. Unlike many rulers of his era, who met violent ends on distant battlefields or fell victim to the treachery of ambitious rivals, Æsc was granted the rare privilege of dying peacefully in his own hall, surrounded by his family, advisors, and closest companions. The king's final illness appears to have developed gradually over several months, giving him ample opportunity to complete the arrangements for succession that he had been planning throughout his later years. This extended period of preparation proved crucial for the smooth transfer of power that would follow his death, allowing potential sources of instability to be identified and addressed before they could threaten the kingdom's security. As word of the king's declining health spread throughout Kent and beyond, delegations of nobles, merchants and common people began arriving at Canterbury to pay their respects to the ruler who had guided their kingdom to unprecedented prosperity and stability. These visitors came not only from throughout Kent, but also from the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel, from other Anglo-Saxon realms, and even from British territories that had long been at odds with Germanic expansion. The gathering of so many prominent figures from across early medieval Europe provided a remarkable demonstration of the international respect that Æsc had earned during his long reign. Frankish nobles who had negotiated commercial treaties with Kent stood alongside Saxon war leaders who had fought both with and against Kentish forces, while British chieftains who had learned to respect Æsc's wisdom mingled with Germanic settlers who owed their prosperity to his far-sighted policies. The king's bedchamber became an informal centre of diplomatic activity, as Æsc used his remaining strength to secure final commitments from allied rulers regarding their support for his designated successor. These deathbed negotiations, conducted with all the skill and subtlety that had characterized his approach to statecraft throughout his reign, helped to ensure that the transition to new leadership would proceed smoothly. The religious ceremonies that accompanied Æsc's final days reflected the complex spiritual landscape of early 6th century Kent. While the king remained faithful to the traditional Germanic gods of his ancestors, he showed his characteristic tolerance by welcoming the prayers of Christian clerics who served the Romano-British population of his kingdom. This religious inclusivity, which had been a hallmark of his reign, continued to characterize the kingdom's approach to spiritual matters even during this most solemn period. The distribution of final gifts and bequests provided another opportunity for Æsc to demonstrate the generosity that Germanic tradition expected from successful kings. Valuable treasures that had been accumulated over decades of prosperous rule were distributed among loyal supporters, ensuring their continued allegiance to the dynasty, while also fulfilling the social obligations that bound kings to their followers. The formal appointment of his son Octa as heir and successor was conducted with all the ceremonial dignity that such a momentous occasion required. The transfer of royal regalia, including the crown, scepter, and ceremonial weapons that symbolized royal authority, took place in the presence of the assembled nobles and representatives of allied kingdoms, providing public validation for the new king's legitimacy. When death finally came to the great king, it was reported to have been as peaceful as his reign had been successful. According to later accounts, Æsc passed away quietly in the early hours of a crisp autumn morning, his face serene and his breathing gradually slowing until it finally ceased altogether. The long struggle to build and maintain a kingdom that would endure for centuries had come to an end. The immediate response to news of the king's death demonstrated the deep affection and respect that his subjects felt for their departed ruler. Throughout Kent, church bells tolled in mourning while people gathered in village squares and marketplaces to share memories of the king's achievements and to offer prayers for his journey to the afterlife. The genuine grief that was expressed on this occasion contrasted sharply with the relief or indifference that often marked the deaths of less successful rulers. Preparations for the royal funeral began immediately, as Æsc's advisors and family members worked to organize ceremonies that would appropriately honor the memory of such a distinguished king, while also demonstrating the continued strength and stability of the dynasty he had established. The scale and complexity of these preparations reflected both the international significance of the occasion and the resources that Kent's prosperity had made available for such purposes. The funeral ceremonies extended over several days, allowing time for delegations from distant kingdoms to arrive and participate in the mourning process. These extended observances served important political purposes in addition to their religious and ceremonial functions, providing opportunities for the new king to receive formal recognition from allied rulers and to begin establishing the relationships that would be crucial for his own successful reign. The location chosen for Æsc's burial was carefully selected to reflect both his status as king and his role as founder of a lasting dynasty. Unlike the traditional Germanic practice of burial in isolated barrows, Æsc was interred in a prominent location that would serve as a visible reminder of his achievements and a symbol of the continuity of royal authority under his successors. The grave goods that accompanied the king on his final journey reflected both his personal achievements and the prosperity of the kingdom he had built. Weapons of exceptional quality, jewelry that demonstrated the sophisticated craftsmanship available in Kent, and coins that testified to the kingdom's commercial success were all placed in the royal tomb, along with other items that would ensure the king's comfort in the afterlife. The funeral feast that concluded the mourning period provided an opportunity for the new king to demonstrate his own generosity, while also celebrating the achievements of his predecessor. The abundance of food and drink that was provided for the hundreds of guests who attended this celebration offered tangible evidence of Kent's continued prosperity and the dynasty's ability to maintain the high standards of royal hospitality that Æsc had established. The international character of these funeral observances was particularly significant for the future of Anglo-Saxon England. The presence of rulers and nobles from throughout early medieval Europe provided recognition of Kent's status as a major power, while also establishing precedents for the diplomatic relationships that would shape political development throughout the British Isles for centuries to come. The literary celebrations of Æsc's life and achievements that were composed during this period helped to establish his reputation for posterity, while also providing models for future royal biographies. Court poets crafted elaborate verses that celebrated the king's military victories, his success in promoting prosperity, and his wisdom in governing a diverse population. These literary works ensured that memory of Æsc's achievements would be preserved long after the physical monuments of his reign had crumbled into dust. The smooth transition to new leadership that followed Æsc's death provided perhaps the most fitting tribute to his success as a king and dynasty founder. The institutional foundations that he had established proved strong enough to support the transfer of power without the violent conflicts that had characterized many early medieval successions. This peaceful transition demonstrated that Æsc had succeeded in creating something more enduring than a personal monarchy. He had established a kingdom that could survive and prosper, regardless of the particular strengths or weaknesses of individual rulers. The impact of Æsc's death extended far beyond the borders of Kent itself, as rulers throughout early medieval Europe recognized that one of the most successful and respected kings of the age had passed from the scene. The diplomatic relationships that he had carefully cultivated over decades would need to be renewed and maintained by his successor, while the commercial networks that had brought prosperity to Kent required continued attention and development. As the kingdom settled into the period of formal mourning that would mark the transition between reigns, the people of Kent could reflect with pride on the remarkable transformation that had taken place during Æsc's long rule. The prosperous and stable kingdom that would be inherited by his successor bore little resemblance to the collection of struggling settlements that he had inherited from his father Hengist nearly a quarter century earlier. In the months and years that followed King Æsc's peaceful death, the Kingdom of Kent entered a new chapter in its remarkable history, one that would test the strength of the institutions and traditions that the great king had established, while demonstrating the enduring wisdom of the policies and approaches that had characterized his long and successful reign. The accession of King Æsc, Æsc's son and designated heir, proceeded with the smooth efficiency that had been carefully planned during the previous reign. The new king possessed many of his father's qualities: intelligence, diplomatic skill, and a deep understanding of the complex challenges facing early medieval rulers. But he also brought his own perspectives and priorities to the task of governing Kent in an increasingly complex international environment. One of Octa's first challenges was to maintain the delicate balance between continuity and adaptation that would characterize successful governance in the post-Æsc era. The policies and institutions that his father had established had proven their effectiveness over nearly a quarter century of successful rule. But changing circumstances required flexibility and innovation within this established framework. The commercial relationships that had formed the foundation of Kent's prosperity during Æsc's reign continued to flourish under the new king's leadership. The trading networks that connected Kentish merchants with their counterparts throughout Europe remained active and profitable, while the diplomatic agreements that had facilitated this commerce were renewed and strengthened through careful negotiation with allied rulers. The Frankish connection, in particular, remained crucial to Kent's continued prosperity and international standing. The kingdoms across the Channel were growing in power and influence under rulers like Clovis and his successors, and their friendship continued to provide important advantages for Kent in both military and commercial terms. Octa's maintenance of these relationships demonstrated his understanding of the international foundations of his kingdom's success. The internal development of Kent also continued to progress under the new king's leadership. The agricultural prosperity that had been achieved during Æsc's reign was maintained and even expanded, as improved farming techniques and more efficient land use continued to increase the productivity of the kingdom's fertile territories. The population growth that had characterized the previous reign continued, supported by both natural increase and continued immigration from Germanic homelands. Urban development received particular attention during this period, as Canterbury and other Kentish towns continued to grow in size and sophistication. The commercial activities that had been encouraged by royal policy created demand for the services and products that urban centers could provide, while the concentration of wealth in these communities supported the development of increasingly sophisticated crafts and industries. The legal and administrative systems that Æsc had established proved their worth during the transition period and beyond. The procedures for royal governance that had been developed during the previous reign continued to function effectively under new leadership, while the legal institutions that administered justice throughout the kingdom maintained their reputation for fairness and efficiency. The military organization of Kent also remained strong during this period, as the defensive preparations that had been undertaken during Æsc's reign continued to provide security against external threats. The warrior traditions that remained central to Germanic culture were carefully balanced with the need for internal peace and stability, creating a military system that could respond effectively to challenges while avoiding the internal conflicts that plagued many other early medieval kingdoms. Religious life in Kent during the post-Æsc period continued to reflect the tolerance and accommodation that had characterized the previous reign. While most of the kingdom's Germanic population remained faithful to their traditional gods, Christian communities continued to flourish under royal protection. This religious diversity remained one of Kent's distinctive characteristics and would prove particularly important when the kingdom eventually underwent conversion to Christianity. The international reputation that Kent had achieved under Æsc's leadership continued to serve the kingdom well during this transitional period. Other Anglo-Saxon rulers looked to Kent as a model for successful state building, while continental European powers continued to regard the kingdom as an important ally and trading partner. This international recognition provided both opportunities and obligations for the new king, as he worked to maintain his kingdom's position in the complex diplomatic environment of early medieval Europe. The cultural achievements of Æsc's reign also provided a foundation for continued development under his successors. The core traditions that had been established during the previous reign continued to attract scholars, poets, and craftsmen from throughout Europe, while the artistic and literary works produced under royal patronage helped to preserve and develop the distinctive character of Kentish civilization. The dynastic stability that Æsc had worked so carefully to establish proved its value during this period of transition and beyond. The clear succession procedures that had been developed during the previous reign helped to prevent the conflicts that might otherwise have threatened the kingdom's unity, while the institutional foundations of royal authority provided continuity even as individual rulers changed. The economic prosperity that had been achieved during Æsc's reign continued to provide resources for royal governance and public works during the transitional period. The commercial success of Kentish merchants created tax revenues that supported royal administration, while the agricultural abundance of the kingdom's farms provided the basic necessities of life for a growing population. The social integration that had been achieved within Kentish society during the previous reign continued to deepen during this period. The harmony between Germanic and Romano-British populations that had been one of Æsc's greatest achievements remained strong, creating a unified society that was greater than the sum of its parts. The territorial expansion that had characterized much of Æsc's reign was consolidated and secured during this period, as the new king worked to ensure that recently acquired territories were fully integrated into the kingdom's administrative and defensive systems. This consolidation process required careful attention to local conditions and customs, while maintaining overall unity of governance. The influence of Æsc's reign extended far beyond the immediate boundaries of Kent itself, as other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms adopted policies and institutions that had proven successful in the southeastern realm. This process of imitation and adaptation helped to spread innovative governmental practices throughout early medieval Britain, while also enhancing Kent's reputation as a leader in political development. The legacy of religious tolerance that Æsc had established would prove particularly significant in later years when Kent became the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom to officially convert to Christianity. The foundations for this transformation had been laid during Æsc's reign through policies that demonstrated respect for different religious traditions while maintaining overall social harmony. The commercial networks that had been established during Æsc's reign continued to evolve and expand during this period, creating new opportunities for economic development, while also strengthening the international relationships that supported Kent's prosperity. These trading connections would prove increasingly important as European commerce continued to develop throughout the early medieval period. The administrative innovations that had been developed during Æsc's reign provided models that would influence governmental development throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The procedures for tax collection, legal administration, and military organization that had proven successful in Kent were gradually adopted by other kingdoms, contributing to the development of common institutions that would eventually facilitate political unification. As the immediate transition period following Æsc's death drew to a close, it became clear that the great king had succeeded in creating something truly remarkable, a kingdom that could maintain its strength and prosperity even after the departure of its founding monarch. The institutions, traditions, and relationships that he had established provided a solid foundation for continued development, while maintaining sufficient flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. The long-term influence of Æsc's reign would extend far beyond his own lifetime, or even the duration of his dynasty. The model of successful kingship that he had provided would inspire future generations of Anglo-Saxon rulers, while the policies and institutions that he had established would continue to shape the development of English civilization for centuries to come. As we draw our gentle journey through the life and times of King Æsc to its peaceful close, we can rest comfortably knowing that we have witnessed the remarkable story of a ruler whose vision and wisdom helped to shape the very foundations of English civilization, creating a legacy that would endure long after the last echoes of his name had faded from the halls where his descendants would reign. In the quiet moments before sleep claims us completely, it is fitting to reflect upon the extraordinary transformation that took place during those crucial decades when Æsc guided Kent from its origins as a Germanic settlement to its emergence as one of early medieval Europe's most prosperous and stable kingdoms. The young prince who had fought beside his father Hengist at the Battle of Aylesford had grown into a wise and far-sighted king whose policies would influence the development of Anglo-Saxon England for generations to come. The peaceful succession that followed Æsc's death provided perhaps the most telling evidence of his success as both a king and a dynasty founder. The institutional frameworks that he had so carefully constructed proved strong enough to support the transfer of power without the violent upheavals that characterized so many early medieval transitions. This stability, more than any military victory or diplomatic triumph, demonstrated the lasting value of the foundations that he had laid. The commercial prosperity that flourished under Æsc's rule created patterns of trade and economic development that would continue to benefit Kent long after his passing. The trading relationships with continental Europe that he had so carefully cultivated provided his successors with resources and opportunities that enabled the kingdom to maintain its position as one of the wealthiest and most influential realms in early Anglo-Saxon Britain. The cultural synthesis that Æsc had encouraged between Germanic and Romano-British traditions created a distinctive Kentish civilization that combined the best elements of both heritages. This harmonious fusion of different cultural streams would serve as a model for the broader integration that would eventually characterize English society as a whole, demonstrating that diversity could be a source of strength rather than division. The religious tolerance that marked Æsc's approach to governance would prove to have lasting significance for the future of Christianity in England. While the king himself remained faithful to the traditional gods of his ancestors, his policies of accommodation and respect for different religious traditions created an environment in which Christian communities could flourish peacefully alongside their pagan neighbors. The legal and administrative innovations that were developed during Æsc's reign provided precedents and procedures that would influence governmental development throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The sophisticated balance between central authority and local autonomy that characterized Kentish governance offered a model for effective royal administration that other kingdoms would study and adapt to their own circumstances. The diplomatic relationships that Æsc had established with rulers throughout early medieval Europe demonstrated that Germanic kingdoms could take their place as equals among the established powers of the post-Roman world. The respect and recognition that Kent received from Frankish kings and other continental rulers provided validation for the experiment in state building that Æsc had undertaken. The military organization that was developed during Æsc's reign successfully balanced the traditional warrior culture of the Germanic peoples with the need for internal peace and external security. This synthesis of martial traditions with practical defensive requirements created a military system that could protect the kingdom's prosperity without threatening its stability. The urban development that flourished under Æsc's patronage created centers of commerce and culture that would continue to serve as focal points for Kentish civilization long after his death. Canterbury, in particular, would go on to become one of the most important religious and cultural centers in medieval England. Building upon the foundations that were laid during this crucial period, The agricultural abundance that characterized Kent during Æsc's reign was not simply the result of favorable natural conditions, but also reflected the careful policies and improvements that were encouraged by royal leadership. The techniques and innovations that were developed during this period would continue to support the kingdom's prosperity for centuries to come. The social harmony that was achieved within Kentish society during Æsc's reign created a model of successful integration that would influence attempts at unification throughout early medieval Britain. The demonstration that different ethnic and cultural groups could work together peacefully and productively provided hope for the eventual creation of a unified English nation. The literary and artistic achievements that flourished under Æsc's patronage preserved and developed the cultural traditions of the Germanic peoples, while also creating new forms of expression that reflected the unique character of life in post-Roman Britain. These cultural works would continue to influence Anglo-Saxon literature and art for generations to come. As we settle into the comfortable drowsiness that signals the approach of peaceful sleep, we can take comfort in knowing that King Æsc's story is ultimately one of hope and achievement. In an age often characterized by violence and instability, he demonstrated that wisdom, tolerance, and careful planning could create lasting prosperity and peace. The kingdom that Æsc built would continue to flourish long after his passing, serving as a beacon of stability and prosperity in early medieval Europe. His descendants would build upon the foundations that he had laid, eventually presiding over Kent's conversion to Christianity and its integration into the broader Anglo-Saxon cultural and political systems that would shape English civilization. The legacy of Æsc's reign extended far beyond the boundaries of Kent itself, influencing the development of kingship, governance, and society throughout Anglo-Saxon England. The model of successful state building that he had provided would inspire future generations of rulers who sought to create stable and prosperous kingdoms from the diverse populations and complex challenges of post-Roman Britain. In the end, perhaps the most fitting tribute to King Æsc's memory is the simple fact that his achievements created the conditions for peaceful sleep, both for his contemporaries, who could rest secure in the knowledge that their kingdom was well governed and prosperous, and for us today as we drift gently towards slumber, while contemplating the remarkable story of one of history's most successful and far-sighted rulers. May your dreams be filled with the gentle sounds of prosperity and peace that characterized life in Æsc's Kent, the lowing of cattle in fertile meadows, the calls of merchants in busy markets, the laughter of children playing safely in village streets, and the quiet satisfaction of a people who knew they were blessed with wise and benevolent leadership. Sleep well, dear listener, and may the story of King Æsc and his remarkable kingdom bring you the same peace and contentment that his subjects enjoyed during those golden years when Kent first emerged as a shining example of what could be achieved through wisdom, tolerance, and dedication to the common good. Good night, and sweet dreams.